This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and this week our subject is we're going back to ancient Sumeria and Babylon, and we are looking at a goddess called Tiamat. Now, Tiamat is often represented as a dragon or a serpent, although it's been pointed out that it's not really clear from her description that's what she is. Tiamat is a very classic creative destructive kind of deity that we see in the divine feminine. Because on the one hand, it's noted that there are two parts to her myth. The first part is where there's this idea of mixing of the waters. Because she is a goddess who represents the saltwater ocean. We're going to see a similar thing in ancient Greece, and then there's other things, similar things in other cultures as well, where you have this idea of mixing of fresh and salt water. And there's this idea that the original gods come out of this, in the same way that we see some of this mythology in ancient Greece, for example, with Oceanus and Tethys. You have the fresh water and the salt water, and they are, and they produce like all the different, in the case of the Greek, they produce all the lakes and the streams and the rivers, all of these other water sources that flow through different places. And so there's a creative aspect to Tiamat, but then there's also something that they call the chaos Kampf. That's the term that is used. The idea that Tiamat becomes a monstrous deity, producing monsters. And in her production of these monsters that she attempts to slay the gods. And then there becomes this battle of the great storm god who needs to fight against her to gain supremacy and eventually defeats her. So it's a little more complex than that. One of the things I will have to say about Tiamat right up front, when I do these podcasts, I'm always comparative. So I'm talking about the core deity, but I may say things like, oh, well, in India there's this, or in Greece there's this. And I think some people have taken me to task saying, stay on topic. And it's like, no, actually, you cannot understand the central figure without reference to these other cultures, because it seems very likely that the close relationship between some of these myths is not accidental. And in order to understand all the components of the story, you have to understand that, what the similar stories were in the neighboring the neighboring countries or tribal kingdoms or whatever was around at that particular time. It's important because otherwise it's very difficult to understand what the underlying assumed story is here. Okay. And as we frequently point out here at Chthonia, is that the story as it's often presented to us, whether it be in school or whether it be through TV movies, through role-playing games, through whatever it is, we end up getting an idea about that deity and its qualities that may not be correct. Or we may get an idea that a particular deity is evil when perhaps, it's really not evil at all. It just represents a particular force or is doing its thing. Or we may think of a particular deity as representing something good when in fact that may also not be the case. And it's important to understand, one of the things I would like to break down as I'm doing these, as I go through all of these different figures in these different podcasts, is the idea that there's this straight up good-evil split. These are the guys on the good side and these are the ones on the evil side. That's an idea that really needs to go away. It's prevalent in Western religion, and when we think of gods, okay, this is why we even have a hard time thinking about ancient gods. Because our idea of God comes from, whatever monotheistic religion we may have been raised in. Now, there are people, of course, who are raised in non-monotheistic religions, like Hinduism, for example, or Buddhism, which technically has even though there are Buddhist deities, there's technically no God in Buddhism at all. There's a difference in the way that we think about God. And that's why a lot of people don't like to make the distinction now between Western religion and Eastern religion. But there is definitely a difference in the way that the idea of God is viewed. in the West, we have moved from that more polytheistic view of the gods and from these particular narratives, and understanding these particular narratives too, particularly these storm god narratives, because Tiamat's foil here is a god, at least in most versions, is a god called Marduk, who is a storm god. And as I've mentioned before, storm gods like Zeus or Jupiter or Yahweh, the god of the Jewish and Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions, slightly different inflections there, but the same central deity that's usually spelled in Hebrew lettering Yod He Vav He. That's what's thought of, was originally a storm god. Okay. And Yahweh, very likely, or Yehovah, I think is the more correct way to say it, probably comes from older Canaanite deities as well. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts, so I don't want to get too repetitive, but it's some of the background that you need to understand what the importance of these stories are and what, and sort of how they fit together and how they've shaped what we've come to believe. Because one of the things we really need to question in our culture is what we believe and why we believe it. What are the foundations of it, and are our foundations just built on something else? Are we taking this myth and giving it an interpretation that we shouldn't? And the most basic form of this is the idea that the dark or the monstrous figure somehow represents something hellish, something demonic, something evil. And we really need to get away from these ideas, because we transfer these ideas to other things, to anything that we consider to be unfamiliar or unpredictable or just unknown to us. And then that's the way that we end up demonizing it, by turning it into something demonic or something monstrous. And we do it in ways that, maybe not in obvious ways, but, we can do this with, for example, groups of people who we feel threatened by. It has a translation to a lot of different places. So that's why it's important that we understand what are the core stories that we have in our consciousness, and, how do we look at them with fresh eyes? Okay. I don't want to digress too much in that kind of philosophical lecture. It's not the first time I have, but also there's people who may never have heard this podcast before. And that is at least part of where I'm going with creating this kind of content. So let's start. Now, who is Tiamat? I've kind of talked a little bit about who she is. I'm going to, let's see. Well, I'm going to read this particular, let's see. I'm going to read this. There's a couple of different descriptions of her, but I'm going to start with this one. In the religion of ancient Babylon, Tiamat is a primordial goddess of the sea, mating with Apsu, the god of the groundwater, to produce younger gods. She's the symbol of chaos in primordial creation. She's referred to as a woman and described as the glistening one. It's suggested there are two parts to the Tiamat mythos, the first in which she is a creator goddess through a sacred marriage between different waters, peacefully creating a cosmos through successive generations. In the second Chaos Kampf, Tiamat is the monstrous embodiment of primordial chaos. Some identify her with images of a sea serpent or dragon. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, she gives birth to the first generation of deities. Her husband Apsu correctly assumes they are all planning to kill him and usurp his throne. Okay, now this doesn't, just to stop for a minute, this has a lot of familiarity with the myth of Kronos, who castrates his father in the Greek mythology in Hesiod's Theogony. The gods are born from the earth mother Gaia and the sky god Uranus. And again, Gaia produces monsters, so which Uranus is horrified by and ashamed of, so he pushes them back down in her, and which is a really pretty direct metaphor for the kinds of way we repress things that we're ashamed of or we don't like. And so Gaia gets tired of this and appeals to her children, and it's Kronos, god of time, who castrates his father, thus separating heaven and earth. And now you've got a space, you've got a field of space, and you've got a field of time, a field where death can occur. And that is the world that we live in. We don't live in the field of eternity that the gods might live in. We live in a field where we have time, okay, and that we measure things out that way. So and in that, and of course in the Greek myth, Kronos, as his sister wife Rhea starts giving birth to what become the Olympian Greek gods, he keeps swallowing them, okay, until she gets tired of this, gives him a stone to swallow, and hides Zeus, and Zeus is going to be, who is also a storm god, by the way, ends up being, Zeus ends up, going, raising up, causing his father to regurgitate all of his sisters and brothers. And then he goes to battle. It becomes the war between, they call it the Titanomachy, the war between the Olympians and the Titans. So it's similar to the Chaos Kampf. It's this idea of these older chaotic forces fighting against the forces of order. Okay, so to keep on with this story, it says that enraged, she also wars upon her husband's murderers. Okay, this is Tiamat. And Apsu is in fact killed. So she takes on the form of a massive sea dragon, and then it says she is slain by Enki's son, the storm god Marduk, not before she brought forth the monsters of the Mesopotamian pantheon, including the first dragons, whose bodies she filled with poison instead of blood. Marduk then forms the heavens and the earth from her divided body. Okay, so that's the basic story of Tiamat. I'm actually going to read you. I have a condensed version of the story here. That when I teach my mythology classes, I could read directly from the Enuma Elish, like the translation, but reading from the tablets, ask any of my students, is extremely confusing because the story repeats itself like on the next tablet, and they're like, wait, didn't I just read this? And there's a lot of things omitted and left out, so it's better to have a more continuous narrative. So I'm going to read this version I had found. I know I found it on a mythology site somewhere. I can't remember the name of it, and I didn't. Normally I write that down, but I didn't have it on this one for some reason. Okay, so the title of this is Marduk Creates the World from the Spoils of Battle. In the beginning, neither heaven nor earth had names. Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, goddess of the salt oceans, and Mumu, the god of the mist that rises from both of them, were still mingled as one. There were no mountains, there were no pasture land, not even a reed marsh could be found to break the surface of the waters. By the way, this sounds a lot like Genesis 1, too, if you read the Bible. It was then that Apsu and Tiamat parented two gods, and then two more who outgrew the first pair. These further parented gods until Ea, who was the god of rivers and was Tiamat and Apsu's great-grandson, was born. Ea was the cleverest of the gods, and with his magic, Ea became the most powerful of the gods, ruling even his forebears. Apsu and Tiamat's descendants became an unruly crowd. Eventually, Apsu, in his frustration and inability to sleep with the clamor, went to Tiamat, and he proposed to her that they slay their noisy offspring. Tiamat was furious at his suggestion to kill their clan, but after leaving her, Apsu resolved to proceed with his murderous plan. When the young gods heard of his plot against them, they were silent and fearful, but soon Ea was hatching a scheme. He cast a spell on Apsu, pulled Apsu's crown from his head, and slew him. Ea then built his palace on Apsu's waters, and it was there that with the goddess Damkina he fathered Marduk, the four-eared, four-eyed giant, who was god of rain and storm. The other gods, however, went to Tiamat and complained of how Ea had slain her husband. Aroused, she collected an army of dragons and monsters, and at its head she placed the god Kingu, whom she gave magical powers as well. Even Ea was at a loss to how to combat such a host, until finally he called on his son Marduk. Marduk gladly agreed to take on his father's battle on the condition that he, Marduk, would rule the gods after achieving victory. The other gods agreed, and at a banquet they gave him royal robes and a scepter. Marduk armed himself with a bow and arrows, a club, lightning, and he went in search of Tiamat's monstrous army. Rolling his thunder and storms in front of him, he attacked, and Kingu's battle plan soon disintegrated. Tiamat was left alone to fight Marduk, and she howled as they closed for battle. They struggled as Marduk caught her in his nets. When she opened her mouth to devour him, he filled it with the evil wind that served him. She could not close her mouth with his gale blasting in it, and he shot an arrow down her throat. It split her heart, and she was slain. After subduing the rest of her host, he took his club and split Tiamat's water-laden body in half like a clamshell. Half he put in the sky and made the heavens, and he posted guards there to make sure Tiamat's salt waters could not escape. Across the heavens he made stations in the stars for the gods, and he made the moon and set it forth in its schedule on the heavens. From the other half of Tiamat's body he made the land, which he placed over Apsu's fresh waters, which now arise in wells and springs. From her eyes he made flow the Tigris and Euphrates. Across this land he made the grains and herbs, the pastures and fields, rains and seeds, cows and ewes, and the forests and orchards. Marduk set the vanquished gods who had supported Tiamat to a variety of tasks. including work in the fields and canals. Soon they complained of their work, however, and they rebelled by burning their spades and baskets. Marduk saw a solution to their labors, though, and proposed it to Ea. He had Kingu, Tiamat's general, brought forward from the ranks of the defeated gods, and Kingu was slain. With Kingu's blood, with clay from the earth, and with spittle from the other gods, Ea and the birth goddess Nintu created humans. On them, Ea imposed the labor previously assigned to the gods. Thus, humans were set to maintain the canals and boundary ditches, to hoe and to carry, to irrigate the land and to raise crops, and to raise animals and fill the granaries, and to worship gods at their regular festivals. Okay. Now, that's interesting summary of that particular story, and suggests that the reason that mortals are created are to labor. And it's interesting how we have in our mind this idea that we've never quite shaken that, in order to be a good human being, you have to be working hard all the time. The idea that you should rest or have leisure or anything is we act like that's, well, you're lazy, and, you're shiftless, and, like we have this thing about people, going out there and working hard all the time and being productive all the time. And we see in these kind of mythologies a core narrative that, that psychologically sets the stage for it. Mythologies like these are part of our collective memory, what Jung would call the collective unconscious. And these things affect us without even knowing that they affect us. These are ideas that we assume that this is how things are. Okay. Now, some interesting things about this particular myth. So we have this myth of Tiamat, and we see that her body ends up creating the heavens and the earth. So even in her destruction, there's sort of a creation there. Okay, there's that line between creation and destruction. But we also see that motif, just like we saw in the battle between the Titans and Olympians, of, order having to overcome chaos, that the monsters tend to be representations of chaos. There's something that can devour us, that can swallow us up, take away, who we are, bring death. It becomes this ultimate sort of metaphor for what's unknown, or what's, what's in the depths of things. We're afraid of what's down in the depths. God knows there's many movies and other things about, what lies in the depths. And really unconsciously, we are always afraid of that. When there are major changes in society, people feel, quote unquote, out of their depth. In Jungian terms, conditions like schizophrenia are often treated like a drowning, like you're in the depths and you can't find your way out, onto the dry land. Flood mythology has a lot to do with that too. The idea that you are, something about you has been destroyed, and now, if you survive it and you come out, it's almost like you're reborn. You're something new. And I've talked a little bit about water. I had some other podcasts where I talk about these watery figures and the significance of water. But yeah, so Tiamat tends to represent that dark and primordial ocean. With regard to her appearance, I had said something about this before, and I found this discussion, which is from Wikipedia, by the way. The Wikipedia entry on her is quite extensive and does do a fair amount of research. Not only is true of Wikipedia, and but this one's pretty thoroughly researched. The author here says, though Tiamat's often described as a sea serpent or dragon, no ancient texts exist in which there's a clear association with these kinds of creatures. Identification is debated. The Enuma Elish specifically states that Tiamat did give birth to dragons and serpents, but they are included among a larger and more general list of monsters, including scorpion men and mer-people, none of which imply that any of the children resemble the mother or are even limited to aquatic creatures. In the Enuma Elish, her physical description includes a tail, a thigh, lower parts, which shake together, a belly, an udder, which is like a cow almost, ribs, a neck, a head, a skull, eyes, nostrils, a mouth, and lips. She has insides, possibly entrails, a heart, arteries, and blood. And they say the modern depiction of Tiamat as a multi-headed dragon was popularized in the 70s with D&D players, associating Tiamat with later mythological characters such as Lotan. Yeah, that's what I mean when I say that popular culture sometimes changes, and I mean, obviously there's nothing wrong with doing that. You can take these accounts and you can play with them and you can create fictions out of them that don't resemble the original myth. That's not the point of the fiction. The only problem comes in when people read the fictional account. It's like classes I had where I would be talking about, say, Hercules, but students would say, "Oh, but didn't Hercules do this?" And I'm like, "Where did you get that?" And then I realized they're getting it from the Disney movie on Hercules. I'm like, yeah, that's only loosely based on the original myth, Yeah. So it's interesting. The bottom line is the accurate scholarly way to look at Tiamat is she might be a sea monster, she might not be. It's not clear. I would argue though that she probably is some kind of a sea serpent or monster because she's a goddess of the waters. She has to do with the oceans. I mean, the creatures that live in oceans are creatures that swim. Now, she doesn't have to be, but she's probably not going to resemble a land animal. She's probably going to more resemble, just by a representation of her power, some kind of large, larger than life figure that lives in the sea. So I don't think that it's wrong to interpret Tiamat as a sea serpent. And I'm going to give you another reason for that. Where is it? Okay. There's a couple of other myths that I want to compare this one to. There's actually two or three things. I'm going to talk about, what's the name I'm looking for? Illuyanka, which is a Hittite, actually a male god, and also the tradition of Python, which was mentioned here as an interpretation, but I've gone and done a little more research on it. And also I want to talk a little bit about Leviathan in the Bible and in Jewish literature as well, the Jewish Talmudic literature. There's this idea of the monstrous dragon. Now, the dragon isn't always female, okay? But the story is very curiously the same. So, there's like 3 or 4 different stories. They're very short, but I'm going to tell you what these are. So first, let's talk about Illuyanka, okay? And again, just picking this up, just a quickie from Wikipedia here. In Hittite mythology, Illuyanka was a serpentine dragon slain by Tarhuns, the Hittite incarnation of the Hurrian god of sky and storm. It is known from Hittite cuneiform tablets found at Kurum Bogaskoy, the former Hittite capital Hattusa. The contest is a ritual of the Haitian spring festival of Puruli. And the story is, in the first version, the storm god and Illuyanka fight and the serpent wins. The storm god then goes to the Hattian goddess Inaras for advice. Having promised to sleep with a mortal named Hupasias in return for his help, she devises a trap for the dragon. She goes to him, meaning the dragon is male, with large quantities of food and drink and entices him to drink his fill. Once drunk, the dragon is bound by Hupasias with a rope. Then the storm god appears with the other gods and kills the dragon. Okay, so in one, and that's interesting too, because it's almost as though the dragon is defeated by weighing it down, by intoxication. We see in the Tiamat myth, we see where Apsu is killed by putting a spell on him. So there's a very similar idea there, that the idea that the god loses their sensibility and is not able to defend themselves. Now, in the second version of this myth, after the two gods fight and the storm god loses, Illuyanka takes the storm god's eyes and heart. To avenge himself on the dragon, the storm god marries the daughter of a poor man. They have a son who grows up and marries the daughter of the dragon, Illuyanka. The storm god tells his son to ask for the return of the storm god's eyes and heart as a wedding gift, and he does so. His eyes and heart restored, the storm god goes to face the dragon Illuyanka once more. At the point of vanquishing the dragon, the storm god's son finds out about the battle and realizes he had been used for this purpose. He demands that his father take his life along with Illuyanka's, so Teshub kills them both. A version of this narrative is illustrated on a relief discovered at Malatya. Okay. Now that's an interesting one in which the father, well, that's interesting. The son ends up becoming a sacrifice for the father, in a sense, or acts as atonement, or I guess it would be an act of atonement or vengeance for the father. And that occurs to me that kind of mythology could be a precursor for the idea of, the son who sacrifices themselves. In the case of the Christian myth, the son sacrifices himself for for the sins of mortals, but nonetheless, it's supposed to be a reckoning. It's supposed to be a reparation for damage that's done. And so of course, with the ancient Hittites and the Babylonians, the whole value system and everything is very, very different. So it has this inflection, but we see where we have a very ancient narrative that points to this idea. The other one I want to talk about briefly is Python. Now, Python is also a serpent who is at the oracle at Delphi, which is in Greece. Now, here's the story. It was Python presided at the Delphic oracle. So remember, oracles, there's a connection to the chthonic, to the earth, to the underworld, to being able to prophesize. So the oracle at Delphi is where people would go to learn their future or to seek advice. And this existed in the cult center for its mother, Gaia. So the Earth Mother is there, being the place of the name that was substituted for the earlier Chrysa. Greeks considered the site to be the center of the earth, represented by a stone, the omphalos, or navel, which Python guarded. So, think about it. This is the serpent at the center of the world. And there's a metaphor there for time and for life and everything else, the cycle of time. In the episode on the goddess Hel, we had talked about her son, get the name right, is, let's see, I'm not finding it. I thought I had in the list here that I have, but, you know what, I think it's here. Yes, Jormungandr, the serpent that is big and that lives under the earth and that is sort of swallowing its own tail. These are all, and it encircles the entire earth. This is the idea of a serpent at the navel of the earth. And this serpent is slain by the god Apollo. And there's a symbolism there too. Apollo is supposed to be a god, civilization and learning. It's like air conquering earth. The serpent represents the cycles of life. And Apollo ends up becoming, in opposition to it. In the same way that we see that sort of opposition to, between Apollo and Dionysus, which is not quite so strict as Nietzsche likes to think. But there's this idea of this Python is it says here, he's the chthonic enemy of the later Olympian deity Apollo, who slew it and took over Python's former home and oracle. So this sun god has now taken over the oracle where the chthonic goddess figure and the Earth Mother actually ruled, which unfortunately, leads people to try to interpret that idea of, the Great Mother was there, and then, then the terrible patriarchs took over. No, it's more of it shows more the way in which solar deities, again, in that same narrative of order overcoming chaos. It's the idea that these chthonic forces, these monstrous forces of the earth, represented as monsters or dragons or serpents, have to be slain or overcome in some way by either a storm god or, in this case, by a god associated with the sun. It's a way in which, and that, even though it's really probably more about order and chaos, or the way that rationality triumphs over the chaos and confusion. If they said in one version of this myth, an allegory for the dispersal of fog, of cloud, and vapor that arise from ponds and marshes by the rays of the sun. So Python is associated with that. And if we think of fog and vapor and things like that, we think of something that obscures. If it's foggy, like I'm sitting here in my office and it's very foggy out today, you can't really see what's ahead of you. There's a lack of clarity. It's like the essence of the moon card in the tarot. You can't quite see you don't have full clarity. You can't really see your way forward. The sun brings more light and therefore more clarity. Of course, the brightness of the sun, as Jung has often said, also darkens your shadow. So in the light also, some things become especially when they're split in their way, people who associate themselves more with the light could, they end up repressing or disavowing or trying to, quote unquote, slaughter these other sort of more chaotic aspects of themselves. And again, there's a message there about integrating that material, not destroying it. But and as we see in the Dionysus myth, this idea of this solar deity, which later become, you later see it in the way that the storm gods end up assuming this, like Zeus, for example, or Jupiter or Jove, they become this essence of this of goodness. Okay, and you start to equate goodness with light. Because you associate it with going to the heavens. If being with the gods means you're going up, to the sun. If you're bad, you're going under the earth, right? So it becomes associated with goodness, and then you have the idea of the emperor as the unconquerable sun, the Sol Invictus, and then you have there you have your pun wordplay of son of God, and you have someone like Jesus who is now represented as kind of a sun figure, the bringer of light and salvation, which Dionysus originally was in his own way, where he moves from being chthonic to being a deity associated with the heights, with the celestial, with the heavens. So, yeah, so you have that. That's interesting. It says here, Erwin Rode, who wrote a whole book on the Greek underworld, very long book that I remember reading for my doctorate. He said Python was an earth spirit who, conquered by Apollo and buried under the Omphalos, is a case of one god setting up his temple on the grave of another. And yeah, you'll do see that. You will see quote unquote graves of gods that are shown, even like a grave of Zeus, for example. But it's where their apparent light aspect, their chthonic aspect, because all the gods have a chthonic aspect, all the ancient gods, ends up becoming kind of, pushed under the surface in the same way that we might repress a bad memory or push something to the back of our mind that is unpleasant or that we're ashamed of, or that, oh God, like people will say, I blocked that from my memory. It's not uncommon for that to happen. So this becomes kind of a symbol of that. But you have this mythology, you see it in Tiamat, and you see it in these are other examples of where the female monster, the monstrous serpent of some kind. In the Hittite version, the serpent is male, but there's this destruction of the there's a destruction of the dragon, either to create something new out of it, or it's a case of imposing a kind of order or a new, new set of values on top of it. Now, from the Chaldean history, there's also the story of Amoroka. And I'm going to read this also. Berosus, in the first book of his history of Babylon, informs us that he lived in the age of Alexander. And he mentions there were written accounts preserved at Babylon with the greatest care. These writings contain histories of the heaven and the sea, birth of mankind, and of the kings. There, in one of these stories, there was a time in which there existed nothing but darkness and an abyss of waters, wherein resided most hideous beings, which were produced of a twofold principle. There appeared men, some who were furnished with 2 wings, others with 4, and with 2 faces. They had 1 body but 2 heads, the one that of a man, the other of a woman, and likewise their organs, both male and female. So they're hermaphrodites, basically, but also with wings. Other human figures were seen with legs and horns of goats. Some had horses' feet, while others united hindquarters of the horse with the body of a man, resembling in shape hippocentaurs. Bulls likewise were bred with the heads of men, and dogs with 4-fold bodies, terminated in their extremities with the tails of fishes. Horses also with the heads of dogs, men too and other animals with heads and bodies of horses and tails of fishes. So there's an embodiment of chaos. And in addition to these, there were fishes, reptiles, serpents, and other monstrous animals, which assumed each other's shape and countenance, of all which were preserved delineations in the temple of Belus at Babylon. And the woman presiding over that was Amoroka. In the Chaldean language is Thalath, or in Greek Thalassa, which, by the way, is also considered to be another root of the name of both Tiamat and Tethys. It has to do with the sea. Okay, but it says here it might also equally be interpreted as the moon. All things being in this situation, Belus came, cut the woman asunder. So he cut her in half. And of one half he formed the earth, and the other the heavens. Try to guess which half formed the earth. Probably the feminine half, and the masculine half forms the heavens. At the same time destroyed the animals within her. And so, again, you have this idea of separation. separation is what's required for life, as we know it. We live in a field of opposites. So these gods are seen as creating order, and the way that we create order is by separating out. Everybody has a certain role. Everything's not just kind of mixed together. And that's an idea that in the time that we're coming into now, where we're seeing that these boundary lines are not so strict. We don't have these strict boundaries between good and evil. We don't have these strict boundaries between, even between gender and things like that. I mean, you're seeing that this is not, the way it's sort of been decreed here is not always the way it is. But it does give you an idea of the psychology of people who, for whatever reason, even though you may say, well, geez, none of that's any of their business, especially when it comes to things like, non-binary or transgender kind of things. There's sort of this unconscious, because that Western narrative is so deeply embedded in the unconscious, that they say, well, no, there has to be that split. There has to be that separation. That's what creates order. That's that separation. But that isn't necessarily the case. And this is why one of the reasons frequently you will hear people sort of, quote unquote, not necessarily returning to the divine feminine, but allowing the divine feminine expression. These other attributes are not things to be gotten rid of. As you can see, a goddess like Tiamat, she can be fearful and she can produce monsters, but she can also be protective and can be about, caring and bringing people together and producing and bringing abundance too. So it's not, they're not unilaterally a force of good or evil. And the storm gods are interesting because they're the ones that often, when something is overpowered, for example, if it becomes oppressively humid or oppressively hot, and then you have a thunderstorm. Thunderstorm cools things off and clears the air. So so really the role of a storm god should be to balance things. But frequently in these stories, the storm god is there to vanquish the other side, and you don't really want to, at least once you started applying rationality to it, and once you started applying ethics to it, it becomes about, well, we want to eradicate all the bad things and keep all the good. And it's a more delicate balancing act. These allegorical figures of dogs are the head of men and things like that. They're sort of allegories of what actually sort of lurks in the background. Things are not. When we see things in the very dualistic way that we do, it's got to be this or it's got to be that. We assume that something can't be both, or we assume that something can't, that there's only one way to look at something. Monotheistic religion kind of reinforces that too, because in monotheism, there's the idea of one God, therefore there can only be one way. This is why the three major monotheisms fight with each other, because they say, yes, but we have the correct revelation. And, there's probably truth in all of them, but there's an ability to say, no, there's got to be, in the name of order, there's got to be one way. And that doesn't really represent the reality. What we need to face up to is the kind of psychological realities and also the realities of nature that this represents. It represents the fact that, no, it's not, even in the sciences, we like there's very strict laws and, cause and effect, and this begets that. And yeah, okay, generally speaking, things are fairly orderly, but there are also things that are not. And we don't know how to deal with that, and we rebel very hard. We fall back into that tribal attitude of, I'm going to protect my group, and I'm going to, try to keep the other out or put the other down. And the mythologies like this are where this kind of idea stems from. And, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad or evil mythology either. I'm not necessarily putting a moral inflection on it. I'm simply pointing out that, exercising these other kinds of, these dark serpentine forces from our psyche is probably not the best thing to do. As Nietzsche had said, paraphrasing, of course, but he said something to the effect of, be careful when you exercise the devil, that you're getting rid of the best part of yourself. There's things to be gained from exploring these things that are often represented by this kind of dark feminine. Okay, well, the last thing I want to talk about, because I'm kind of going off in my lecturer mood here. It's been a while since I've taught an in-person class. I want to talk a little bit about Leviathan and Behemoth, okay, which are figures that we see mentioned in a few places in the Bible. It's also mentioned in the Midrash, that where I'm just going to say it here. Leviathan is described as a dragon who presides over the sources of the deep, and who with the land monster Behemoth will be served up to the righteous at the end of time. So again, this idea of cutting up the monster to feed and nourish, and the way that Tiamat is cut up, and then she ends up forming, the fertile land and things like that. The Midrash was being composed. It was held that God originally produced a male and female Leviathan, but lest in multiplying the species should it destroy the world, he slew the female, reserving her flesh for the banquet that will be given to the righteous on the advent of the Messiah. Rashi's commentary on Genesis 1:21 repeats the tradition. God created the great sea monsters, the Tanamim. According to this legend, refers to the Leviathan and its mate. God created a male and female Leviathan, then killed the female and salted it for the righteous. For if the Leviathans were to procreate, the world could not stand before them. And of course, he would kill the female because the female might mate with something else too. So, and it will be served as feast to the righteous. This is from the Baba Bathra in the Talmud. The Leviathan will be slain and its flesh served as a feast to the righteous in the time to come. Its skin used to cover the tent where the banquet will take place. The festival of Sukkot, therefore, concludes with a prayer recited upon leaving the Sukkah, which that's a word for booth. May it be your will, Lord our God and God of our forefathers, that just as I have fulfilled and dwelt in the Sukkah, may I merit in the coming year to dwell in the Sukkah in the skin of Leviathan next year in Jerusalem. Okay. And it says, when Leviathan is hungry, he sends forth from his mouth a heat so great as to make all the waters of the deep boil, and if he would put his head into paradise, no living creature could endure the odor of him. His abode is in the Mediterranean Sea, and the waters of the Jordan fall into his mouth. And, and in its, the fish that swallowed Jonah, in another Midrash, it's in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. It is stated that the fish which swallowed Jonah narrowly avoided being eaten by Leviathan, which eats one whale per day. So apparently Leviathan's very big. So you have these representations of these monsters, and you have the idea of the monster being cut up by some kind of a storm god or the son of a god or something. There's this kind of righteous figure. So you end up seeing this being kind of conflated with salvation mythologies, like the mythology of Jesus, because yet you see in Revelations too this idea of Jesus kind of coming to, slay the great beast or subdue or slay the great beast that rises up. And so we start to equate in that context. We start to say, these storm gods, these gods are gods of righteousness, or the Saint Michael image of coming down with his fiery sword to slay. And these are ways in which we try to rid ourselves of things, but things we should not be trying to necessarily rid ourselves of. Things that we should be kind of looking in the face and saying, okay, what is their purpose? What is, we all have to pass through these unpleasantries of life, these darknesses. And how do you come out on the other side? You don't come out, you can't just say, I'm not going to ever have any of those experiences. I'm just going to cut all, you can't. I mean, you can try. This is why also in a lot of these mythologies, the other one is Zeus and Typhon. That's another one I'm forgetting about when the Earth Mother sends up Typhon, who she bears with Tartarus, the depths. Typhon comes and Zeus does battle with Typhon, who nearly annihilates the world with his fiery breath. And Typhon is consigned to Tartarus. But again, there's that same idea of the dragon. But you notice the dragon, most of these cases, is never exactly killed. Even in this case where Tiamat's killed, it's like her body becomes the firmament on which we are able to live. She represents that separation. She represents some kind of a unity of something. And I think it also represents why, as humans, we can't live in, we always think of, I see people who, for example, look back at the story of the Garden of Eden and say, oh, see, Adam and Eve messed up. If they hadn't messed up, look what a perfect scenario we're living in. And myths like the Tiamat myth show us that no, that's not exactly how it is. You can't live in the field of the gods because you're not actually living. those fields are very chaotic. There's no, anything goes. I mean, yes, there are gods of order that battle against gods of chaos, but the reality is that the forces of the world you occupy are not, they're not meant to be all, unicorns and roses, I guess, or, all pleasantries. It's not, living outside the field of time. It's not possible to do it. Unfortunately, things like death are a precondition of being able to kind of have the life that we have that's orderly, where we measure things in time and we do things, according to certain stages of our life and so forth. So, yeah, you can't, you can't live in that unified field. In some fashion, some of these myths that I'm reading to you, they have to do with the fact that that's really sort of a chaotic state, and one that, in the kind of ways that we're viewing things as separate, would be very unsettling to us, would be probably more than our minds could handle. So just some things to think about there. I'll mention really quickly, too, I usually go over the etymology of the names initially, and I just want to make a quick mention of that before I end. Okay. Walter Burkert, who's a very famous Greek historian of religion, or historian of Near Eastern religion, really, and Thorkild Jacobson argue for a connection of Tiamat with the Akkadian word for sea, tamtu, which following an earlier form, Tiamatum. And Burkert continues by making a linguistic connection to Tethys, who is she's a freshwater goddess. Oceanus represents the salt water in Greek. He finds the later form, Thala, to be related clearly to the Greek Thalata, or Thalassa, which is sea. The Enuma Elish is named for Tzinkippet, when above the heavens did not exist, nor the earth below. Apsu, the freshwater ocean, was there, the first begetter, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea, she who bore them all. They were mixing their waters. It is thought that female deities are older than male ones in Mesopotamia, and Tiamat may have begun as part of the cult of Namu, a female principal watery creative force, with equally strong connections to the underworld, which predates the appearance of Ea and Enki. Okay. Harriet Crawford finds this mixing of the waters to be a natural feature of the middle of the Persian Gulf, where fresh waters from the Arabian aquifer mix and mingle with salt waters of sea. It's especially true in the region of Bahrain, whose name in Arabic is Two Seas. Okay. And also, this is another thing that was mentioned to me, and was also mentioned to me by a Jewish scholar at one point, is claimed to be a cognate with the Northwest Semitic word tehom, the deep or abyss, which you see in Genesis 1:2, when they refer to the abyss in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth out of this abyss, which is known as tehom, which is said to come from Tiamat. So Tiamat becomes a representation of the abyss. But remember that abyss can also represent possibility. It doesn't necessarily represent monsters that are going to kill you. It's only if it's, only being approached in a certain way does it become something dangerous. Like all of these things, they have to be approached with care, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be approached. Okay, that's enough. I hope this one was not too philosophical and too kind of off the rails, but these types of creation myths, to me, have a lot more to do with human psychology and with the core narratives that create the foundation, of all of our assumptions about these figures. And really, if you want to just look at the masculine and feminine part of it, about our idea of this sort of masculine hero, storm god warrior, versus the monstrous feminine, and that idea is one that be careful of demonizing all these feminine creatures as kind of monsters. That's not it's not really helpful to you, and it just maintains the kind of toxic splits that we tend to have in ourselves psychologically, because we're not able to integrate those things, because we have some kind of unconscious assumption that that's not how things are. Okay. I want to thank you again for listening. Please check out Chthonia.net, which at the moment has all of my works. There'll be a new liminalreiki.com coming. Check my social media, which is Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter, and also just Chthonia on YouTube. And if you would like to support my work, patreon.com/Chthonia. I have that, and I'm trying to do more. I'm hoping to have a few more special podcasts for patrons, and in fact, they may have already gotten some of them by the time I publish this one. because I always try to record some episodes in advance. So I'm not recording them the night before I put them up. So it's possible that they'll have that, but there are some extra benefits. Certainly, at the minimum, you get access to the podcast earlier than others, and there's some other benefits. Sometimes I have some giveaways, extra podcasts, and eventually there'll be discounts on things like courses and stuff when that comes about. Thanks again to all of you who have been supporting me so far. I really appreciate those of you who have recently subscribed and those who have been around for the last couple of years. Along with me. And with that, I will see you in the next episode.